Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Well, good evening and welcome to the program. I'm James Morrow, filling in for Peter Credlin this evening. Here's what we've got coming up on the show tonight. Labor's diabolical duo of O'Neill and Giles are touting big changes to immigration, pledging to regain control of the numbers. But you don't have to dig very deep to realize that we're still very much on track to see record numbers coming into the country with today's announcement, noting nothing more than tinkering. Plus, despite all the signs showing Australia is well off track to meet its emissions goals, Chris Bowen is doubling down on the world stage, telling the COP28 conference we need to end fossil fuels. This comes as beef becomes the latest target of the climate zealots. More on that shortly. Plus, speaking of net zero madness, there are some positive signs that average, ordinary Australians have had enough, with more farming communities pushing back on the imposition of massive transmission lines. I'll cross to one such community a little bit later in the program. And Australia Day celebrations in London look in doubt, with the PM's hand-picked High Commissioner closing the door to an annual Australia Day fundraiser and party, citing sensitivities. Honestly, this was an event that helped raise money, and it was scrapped by another unelected bureaucrat. Great. But first, Labor's big lie when it comes to immigration. All weekend long, the Albanese government, bruised by its mishandling of the detainee debacle, flagged that they were going to bring down their big migration reforms as part of the mid-year budget estimates. Well, the announcement and the numbers dropped today. And spoiler alert, if you were waiting for real cuts to Australia's massive migration surge, well, you'll be waiting a little while longer. Let's have a look at what Anthony Albanese said Saturday, setting the tone for the weekend papers.
We have a plan to fix migration by ensuring Australia can get the skilled workers that Australia needs, but putting an end to any abuse and any rorts. Treasury forecasts show that migration is expected to decline substantially over the coming financial year. The new migration strategy we'll announce this week will bring migration back to sustainable levels.
Back to sustainable levels, the man said. Reasonable people might think there was going to be an actual overall cut in the numbers. But did you catch that tricky sleight of hand? Migration, he said, is expected to decline substantially. Of course, it was always going to do that after the post-COVID snapback. But then he continued, they were returning it to, quote, sustainable levels. Is that a substantial decline? Well, here's Claire O'Neill today.
We are going to make sure that we bring numbers back under control, that we build a better planned system around essential things like housing, and perhaps most importantly of all, that we build a program that delivers for the national interest.
So, bringing numbers under control, are they? Well, let's just see about that. Now, in last May's budget, and this is from budget paper number 3 for those following along at home, they projected the following migration intake. In 2022-23, 400,000 people. 2023-24, 315,000. The next year, 260,000 for the next 3 years after that to the 26-27 financial year, for a total across those 5 years of 1,495,000. Now, of course, those numbers were wildly optimistic, as we know. And then they put out their figures today. Those project 510,000 in the 22-23 year, which indicates how little faith we can put in any of the projections. Then 375,000 down to 250, and then up to 255, and then down to 235 again. The total for those playing along at home is 1.625 million people. So even when they're getting it under control, it's still out of control compared to what they had estimated just in the May budget. And note that even with the most optimistic tweaks, they're only projecting a drop of a relatively scant few thousand a year in those final few years. That is, if you believe them, and not that this is just an attempt to make themselves look tough on borders and immigration, which is an issue where they are clearly bleeding support. Now, even being generous and taking the 3 furthest out years, again, they are only tipping a difference of 125,000 migrants over 3 years. And, still again, more than 1.5 million new migrants over 5 years. That's more than an entire Adelaide. And you can bet the architecture to house them won't be anywhere near as charming as that city. And at a time when housing approvals are at a historic low, by the way. Now, I'll tell you, I spoke to Claire O'Neill's office shortly before we went to air, and they told me that, well, yes, the numbers would be far higher without the reforms they announced today, especially around the student visa sector, which, to be fair, was absolutely full of warts and which they do seem to have a commitment to tackle. So well done to the government on that. But if the projections were wrong before and the actual numbers turned out to be much higher than they predicted last year or earlier this year, I'm not sure why that won't continue to happen in the years to come. But as the saying goes, wait, there's more. Because there's another aspect to all of this that I think we need to be very concerned about and which we don't talk about enough. Previous generations of migrants came here to Australia to help build the country and the economy, yes, but also to become Australians. Books and films like They're a Weird Mob celebrated new cultures coming to Australia, but also documented the tension as these newcomers did everything they could to become Australians. Now, though, we live in an age when Labor, and indeed the entire left side of politics, feels ashamed to be Australian. What sort of message does it send, you have to wonder, to people who want to come to Australia for all the various freedoms it provides and opportunities it offers, to hear that the nation's High Commissioner in London has cancelled Australia Day, like he was presiding over some woke inner-city council? I tell you what, no matter how hairy-chested Labor tries to look on this issue, their attempts always fall flat because stories like this always reveal their true nature. Beyond that, new migrants to Australia also face an education system for their kids that will teach them that modern Australia is illegitimate and devoid of culture, and governments that celebrate multiculturalism, fine, but refuse to also promote a shared Australian culture. I mean, I kind of feel sorry for these guys. Did they just come here to contribute to Australian GDP and keep the country from tipping into a formal and not just per capita recession? Increasingly, that seems to be how the government sees all of us, not as individuals, but as economic units and members of ethnic or other identity subgroups to be played against one another. No wonder that besides all the stress these newcomers are putting on our housing markets and other infrastructure, the roads, the hospitals, the schools, there's a real cost being paid in societal cohesion. Last month, the Credlin Foundation found that the proportion of Australians who feel a strong sense of belonging in this country has declined. Sorry, it's plummeted, actually, from 77% in 2007 to just 48% this year. Only 33%, just a third of us, felt great pride in the Australian way of life, and only 40% of us thought there was any point in trying to maintain that. Well, given the way the government has sapped confidence in the very idea of Australia, while encouraging a historically high intake of migrants to treat the nation as a dormitory more than a home, is it any wonder? All right, let's head to Canberra now for tonight's political headlines with Sky News political reporter Olivia Casely.
Good evening. Australia's migration numbers will be slashed as the Australian government slashes the number of foreign students and lifts the bar for skilled workers. It's part of the long-awaited migration strategy to tackle Australia's booming post-COVID migration.
We are going to make sure that we bring numbers back under control.
The long-awaited strategy aims to halve migration levels within just 2 years. The number of arrivals skyrocketed to over 500,000 last financial year. That's expected to drop back to 250,000 by 2025. The government claims by 2027 its new measures will result in 185,000 fewer migrants.
It's not a target, it's an estimate.
This government hasn't planned. They've recklessly opened up the borders, thinking this was a big Australia was the best way to go, but have been found out.
A crackdown on foreign students is also on the way. Tougher English language tests and stricter vetting will be enforced. While the number of temporary migrants will be reduced, the government still wants to attract the best and brightest. But there are concerns more migrants will only add more pressure on already stretched housing supply and also exacerbate congestion.
It's pushing up house prices, it's pushing up rental prices, it's making it harder to see the GP. It just doesn't seem to be anything which is about acting right here and now.
The race to replace Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk is heating up after her announcement she's leaving politics at the end of this week. Stephen Miles, who has support from the Labor left, is considered the frontrunner to take over from Ms Palaszczuk.
I really appreciate her support and endorsement.
He's facing competition from Health Minister Shannon Fentiman.
I have the utmost respect for Stephen Miles. We've been friends for a long time. But as the Premier said yesterday, we do need renewal. We respect each other, but of course we have different views on who is best placed to lead the party.
Well, lots to get through tonight, so joining me to discuss the latest news is Nick Cater from the Menzies Research Centre. Nick, thanks so much for joining me tonight on Credlin. First of all, I wanted to get into these supposed changes to our immigration system. I know you have written at length about Big Australia, social cohesion. What is your take on today's announcement from the government?
Well, they've woken up to political reality, haven't they, James? And they are secretly wanting a big Australia. They've been working towards that. They've thrown the doors wide open, but they're just beginning to wake up to the fact this is very unpopular with the public. Why? Because on the numbers we've been admitting for the last 18 months, we are emitting many more migrants than we are building new homes. So basically, the deficit in housing goes backwards, and so the prices go up and they become more and more unaffordable for Australians. So that's one of the big factors. The other one, I've just spent, I don't know you, I spent an hour this morning in traffic. Roselle Interchange was involved. You won't be surprised to know. But look, I mean, thousands more cars on the road every quarter. So, that's what's happening. We just can't, it is actually affecting people's lives. People people like migrants by and large. I hope so, because I'm one, albeit 30 odd years ago. But we just can't put up with those kind of numbers. And the reality seems to have sunk home to the government.
Yeah, and I mean, do you think that there's starting to be a sense in the community, I suspect that Labor's internal numbers are starting to show them this, that Australians are thinking two things. Number one, as you say, migrants are great. You and I are both migrants to this wonderful country.
Indeed.
But that, it's becoming a bit of a Ponzi scheme, where you bring in more migrants to create the infrastructure to house more migrants. And that becomes the sole sort of almost economic industry in cities like Sydney.
Yeah, well, Treasury's been running this line for years, right? They make next year's economic figures look better because they build in migrants into that. Migrants are supposed to pay more taxes, etc. They forget, of course, that a lot of migrants don't pay taxes, or a lot of them take welfare. I mean, most migrants become very productive and their children are very productive, but it takes some time. So that is not an automatic effect, them contributing. But that's in the Treasury numbers. And any government that says, as Albanese will be finding out, we're going to cut those numbers, Treasury will say, well, we're going to cut our forecast for how much money you've got in your coffers next year.
Indeed. And, also what kind of messages it's sending to migrants when you see the government's hand-picked High Commissioner to the UK, Stephen Smith, announcing that Australia Day, the Australia Day Gala in London, will be cancelled, saying that the event may touch on sensitivities. I mean, Nick, shouldn't a culture that's going to be bringing in large numbers of migrants, trying to bring them into the Australian family, be more confident about itself and not just simply moan about its National Day?
He's touched on some sensitivities, all right. James, I'm sure you'll find it, that Australia Day is one of the best days of the year for me. It's the anniversary of the day I became an Australian citizen in 1992. So for me, it's a big celebration. And for people just to say, well, you know, it's the legitimate day, well, that's really just not fair to me, is it? It's really excluding me and you as new migrants who like to celebrate the day. I think it's a terrible, terrible reaction by our High Commissioner. I don't think there's much chance of him revoking it, but what message does it send to Britain that we're not really proud of Australia? We're enormously proud of Australia and everything that the British contributed to it too, for that matter. And we need to do that. We need to be like New Zealand, don't we, right now, you know, where they're saying, you know, getting more and more saying, well, we are going to call this country New Zealand. We are going to be proud of this country, New Zealand. And we've got to do the same here.
And I think what they're doing over there is a great example of that sort of cultural confidence. But, you know, if they changed the day anyway, people would find something else to complain about. Now, I want to talk about, just on this whole sort of cultural issue, too, really interesting thing here came out. And I want to talk about The Voice. We haven't spoken about that for ages. Megan Davis, one of the co-authors of the Uluru Dialogue, has now blamed a hatred of politicians for The Voice's failure. Actually, I think she might be onto something, but what do you think?
Well, a lot of politicians we love, don't we? Jacinta Price, for one. But
she's great.
What I don't get about Megan Davis and this crowd is, why don't they actually listen to what was said? You know, why didn't they actually go back and rewind the tape about the adverts that were being run, the way people were reacting on talkback radio? It was very obvious. We do not, Megan, write this down, Megan, if you're listening, write this down. We do not want to be divided according to race. Full stop. That's it. That's it. You don't need to know anything more. You know, we might not be too keen on one or two politicians. That's nothing to do with it, honestly. It was just, we don't want to be divided by race. How many times do we have to say that?
Well, speaking, Nick, of politicians that I think some of our viewers might not be too keen on, the New South Wales Liberal Shadow Minister for Health, Matt Keane, he's over in Dubai right now at the UN COP28 Talk Fest, and he thinks Donald Trump and Tony Abbott give Conservatives a bad name when it comes to tackling climate change. Have a look at this, Nick.
I think that Donald Trump and Tony Abbott give Conservatives a bad name when it comes to tackling climate change. They're the outliers when it comes to Conservatives' response, in a policy sense, to one of the greatest challenges of our time. The reality is that most centre-right governments are actually leading the way when it comes to this issue.
Nick, how has Keane's Liberal Party membership not been revoked after this sort of thing?
I don't get involved in Liberal politics, but, you know, I don't. How did he get one in the first place, I think is the question, James. Look, you know, Matt's a nice guy by all accounts, but he just is deluded. And I use that word, you know, very carefully here, deluded on this. Matt, it is not the existential challenge that you seem to think it is. But I just think that Matt needs to go out and talk to some engineers, because you can push this as fast as you can. But at the end of the day, we are beyond peak renewables in this country. Every day there is solar panels wanting to put electricity into the grid. The grid can't take it in the middle of the day. We're saturated with the stuff. What we need is baseload, Matt, baseload.
Bingo.
And you used to be energy minister. You should know what that word is and what that means. We need baseload, not more of this junk energy in the middle of the day from people's solar panels.
And I tell you what, Nick, you know, an awful lot of Conservatives want nuclear power, which I notice a lot of Labour types don't. So, you know, who's anti the science now? Before I let you go, though, I've got to ask you about this crazy story now where, and this hits very close to home for me, the UN is going after beef and dairy as part of their newly released United Nations food map, supposedly designed to save the world from runaway climate change. They also want to ban wood fires, have sugar taxes, do all sorts of other things. Now, I don't know about you, Nick, but for me, like, I would take advice from Vladimir Putin's KGB before I took advice from the UN on what I eat.
And by the way, I think Vladimir Putin is not a vegetarian. I could be wrong on that. I don't think he'd be accepting this. Look, this is nonsense. All this new kind of meatless meat that, Bill Gates is inventing in his backyard or something. Honestly, this stuff has got a higher carbon footprint, if that's your concern, than actual properly grown meat. And, free range beef is perfectly good for the environment and delicious too. So, I think we're getting to the end of this. Fingers crossed. I think we are towards peak woke, James, and I don't think this will last very long, but it is tiresome, isn't it?
I don't know. Every time we get up to sort of the K2 peak of Everest of wokeness, there's this Everest peak of woke right next door. Nick, thanks so much for your time. Go off and enjoy a steak. But coming up, we're going to enjoy talking to economist Judith Sloan to get the latest on the Albanese government's announcements on immigrations from her economic perspective. You're not going to want to miss that after the break. Welcome back to the program. I'm James Morrow, filling in for Peter Credlin. In a moment, we'll be joined by economist and Australian contributing editor Judith Sloan, but I want to have a little chat more about immigration and make this point. Australia took in 500,000 migrants the past year, more than double the amount we were taking in before COVID. This is almost half the population of Adelaide and over 100,000 more than the population of Canberra. And the numbers are overwhelmingly headed to the overcrowded major cities of Sydney and Melbourne. Who knows where they will live? Because for every 1,000 new migrants, as many as 500 new dwellings must be built to accommodate them. That means we're short. We're going to need to build around 800,000 new homes by 28, to keep up with the current intake. And yet, Labour's Housing Australia Future Fund is only slated to construct 30,000 new social and affordable rental homes over the same time. Again, it's a joke. And joining me to talk more about the details of this is contributing economics editor at the Australian newspaper, Judith Sloan. Judith, thank you so much for joining me tonight on the program. I want to start with Labour's announcement today, ostensibly to cut overall migration, but really not so much, was it?
I think it was extremely underwhelming, James. So they don't want to be seen to advocate Big Australia, but they are still advocating Big Australia. And you only need to look at the numbers. So there will have been about 900,000 additional migrants over the first 2 years of the Labor government. And then they're proposing to cut about 200,000, or actually closer to 185,000, over 4 years. So there's a really nice chart in the Financial Review which had it sort of the before and the after, and it was a very narrow wedge. So I think they're trying to accommodate the politics, but in fact they're giving into what I think are very powerful pressure groups who want to keep things as they are. So who are those pressure groups? They're big business, they're the universities, they're the property sector, there are some other groups as well. And it's interesting, and you probably noticed this, James, that those groups have all basically come out in support of the migration policy announced today by Claire O'Neill.
Well, yeah, I did notice that. And I wonder, too, though, how much of, the headlines around this and the headlines that they've worked very hard to generate have been about managing the politics of the issue and hoping that people don't actually notice, because it seems to me that they're in a position where they're either going to have to do something real about this and force an actual GDP recession, or face real pain at the ballot box when people say, you know what, we did not vote for this big Australia. We never voted for it. It never went to the ballot. We're going to punish somebody for this, and you happen to be in the frame for it.
But, James, they're getting very faulty advice from Treasury. So last October, remember, Jim Chalmers decided, probably superfluously, to have a budget in October. At that time, we were told for last financial year the net overseas migration would be 235,000. We thought, OK, that's kind of, what it was before the pandemic. We can live with that. It then was by May, so not much longer after that, they said, well, it's actually going to be 400,000. So that looked very bad. We now know, they're now conceding that it has been 510,000 just in the space of one financial year. And the point is, we also know where it's largely coming from, and this is this almighty surge in international students. Now, I think most governments would think we need to cap these numbers, we need to restrict these numbers. But instead, they've got a few little policies. We're going to make sure that they're better at English. We're going to sort of clamp down on colleges we don't like. Nothing much about the universities, I might add. And so I think what you'll find is that those numbers, they might decline a little bit, but this is really a smoke and mirrors policy response. It's trying to tell the people, they know what the polls are saying, that the people don't like such a large migrant intake, and they're sort of pretending to act on it while keeping their friends happy.
You know, Judith, we talk about skilled migration too, though, and obviously there are places where, you know, we need to get more people in to help do certain specific jobs. But I spent some time today looking at the 674 different skilled occupations on the list. I only got through the A's, but they had author, like of a book. They had arborist, like the guy who comes and does your trees. And they even had amusement center manager. So in case you don't have somebody to manage the tilt-a-whirl for your fate, you can get somebody from overseas to do it. This is clearly another avenue that's just being hugely exploited, isn't it?
James, the list. I mean, you could kind of write a comedy about the list. And as you say, the list is so long. And it's sort of game. So the employer groups, anyone who has any kind of difficulty recruiting a person at potentially the low wage they want to offer, instead try and get that occupation on the list. I mean, for a very long time, we've had accountants, we've had dentists, we've had all sorts of groups who they'll tell you have not been in short supply. I mean, in due course, I think the list has to go, and that would be, I think, serious reform. But at the moment, the government is only sort of tinkering around the edges in terms of the actual migration policy.
And finally, Judith, before I let you go, I want to just ask you about the Commonwealth budgetary numbers. You mentioned the Treasury before. Well, it's come out that the Commonwealth is going to be on the hook for another $80 billion in borrowing costs over the coming decade, thanks to rising interest rates since May. Does this sort of blow up their narrative that, oh, we're doing great and we're, you know, having surpluses to the never just because of commodities prices? And are we in the frame for higher taxes, lower spending, or just more money printing in debt? Judith Sloan.
Well, you know, I thought this story, the cynical me thought, well, this is a drop. So it's obviously the case that, and we saw this actually in the May budget, that what are called the net interest payments, so that's the debt we've accumulated, we're having to pay interest payments, there's a real kick up towards the end of 24, 25, 25, 26, because the low interest debt has to be rolled over. But I think what the Treasurer was trying to say is, look over there, I can't be blamed for that. And he was trying to make the point that, you know, now net interest payments are the fastest growing item in the budget as opposed to the assumed growth in the NDIS. Now, can I emphasise assumed growth? Because I'm not absolutely sure, talking about smoke and mirror policy responses, what we had last week might have sounded good, but it's not clear that the growth in the NDI spending, don't forget, they are promising to get it down from 14% a year to 8% a year, but that is just an assumption at this point. So I think that story that was, you know, dropped to the newspapers is kind of trying to build up that narrative.
Very interesting, very cynical, and I love it. Judith Sloan, thank you so much for your time. Now let's go to the regions, where locals are rallying against the Labor government's renewables agenda after a new IPA report found that Australia could lose 1/3 of its productive agricultural land to solar panels, wind farms, and transmission infrastructure as we crash headlong to net zero. Joining me now to get across the details is Deputy Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, Daniel Wild, who joins us live from Mildura. Daniel, thank you so much for joining me tonight on Credlin. Take us through the findings of your report and what it would mean if we were to be, as they say, a renewable energy superpower off the basis of wind and solar, and the effect that this would have on communities like where you are right now.
Well, James, great to be with you. And as you identified, our research that you reported on today in the Daily Telegraph and across the nation is that under the net zero energy superpower that this government is pursuing, we would as a nation lose up to 1/3 of our prime agricultural farmland. And it's communities like here in Mildura. And today we've also been across the border in Renmark and Berry talking to locals about what this will mean, that are going to be suffering the consequences of this, and the issues will be profound. From a food security perspective, our production will decline rapidly. If you think prices are going up and are bad at the moment, just wait until what happens under net zero when we lose our farmland, when we've got wind turbines and solar panels across them. And it's also a massive energy security issue. As you know, James, about 90% of the minerals and rare earths that you need to construct wind turbines and solar panels are imported from China. So we're giving up our energy. We're giving up our energy sovereignty, losing our food security, and it's causing massive dislocation and disruption in farming communities like here in Mildura.
All while getting the CCP rich, Daniel. Now, tell me, how do the locals in places like Mildura, who have you spoken to? What are they saying when you speak to them? And how are the politics of this playing out?
Well, James, they're revolting. Farmers and local communities are revolting against Labor's net zero mandates. They haven't been consulted on this. As I said, it's dividing the community, it's undermining their local prosperity. It'll impact every Australian. So if you're sitting at home in the city or urban areas and you think this is just an issue for farmers, well, as I said before, when the production of our food goes down, your grocery bills will go up. And James, this is very similar. I was on this program back in June of this year in Western Australia, talking about the Aboriginal cultural heritage laws in Western Australia. And there was a revolt over there against the inner city elites, the bureaucrats and the woke activists that were pushing this onto the regions. And we saw that there was a massive back down there from the government in Western Australia. I'm getting a sense that something very similar now is building across regional communities such as where we are. They're seething in anger. And there's a lot of resentment towards these inner city politicians and bureaucrats that, you know, they're not coming out here. They're not listening to the communities here who are suffering the consequences. And I think there's going to be a big revolt taking place in these communities over the coming months.
You know, Daniel, here I'm often, and I think you probably are too, and a lot of people on this network are accused of being culture warriors and so on. But it seems to me that so much of what's happening here with things like this, and you mentioned heritage laws, this is really where the forefront of the culture war is, because, you know, people in the inner cities who are dominated by Greens electorates, Greens voters, they don't understand what's happening, where their food comes from, how their economy works, and decide that they can impose their urban culture around the rest of the country. Is this an element, I think, of it that people are just sick of being told what to do by, you know, Greens sympathising and Labor that's being pulled by the Greens to the left folks in the cities?
Well, I think that's a very astute observation, James, and that's exactly what's happening. There's no wind turbines in Warringah. They're just shunting it out to these communities, the solar panels and the wind turbines. Not only do they spoil the landscape, but it's all those economic and social issues that we've just discussed. I think there was a lot of that at play in the Voice referendum, which was a revolt against the inner city elites. They're out of touch. And as you and I have spoken about in the past, there's a big realignment taking place in our nation now with what I call the red Liberals, the working class Labor voters that are now moving towards the Liberals. We've seen that in the Voice debate where 70% of Labor seats voted no. So there's a message being sent from the outer suburbs and the regions to the inner cities that they want to stop that encroachment taking place on their way of life, on their culture. You know, when you come out to a regional community out here, they're proud of what they have. The streets are well maintained, the parks look nice. There's only ever one flag in the square, and that's the Australian flag, because they're proud of it. It's a very different culture and way of life in the regions. And as you rightly say, many of those from the inner cities look down in a very demeaning way towards those out here that are really the heart and soul of our nation.
Well, I'm looking forward to taking a big tour of the regions over the Christmas break. Thank you so much, Daniel, for telling us what's happening out there. It sounds absolutely fascinating and like it's going to set up the next election in a really interesting way. Daniel Wild from the IPA, thanks so much for joining us from Mildura. Coming up, Chris Bowen calls for the end of fossil fuels at the climate conference in petrostate Dubai. Plus, we'll get the latest from Gaza as the United States vetoes a motion calling for a ceasefire at the UN. Welcome back to the program. I'm James Morrow, filling in for Peter Credlin. Now let's go overseas to the United Nations, where the United States vetoed a UN resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza over the weekend. Joining me to discuss the latest is strategic analyst, Australia Director Michael Shoebridge. Michael, welcome to the program. Now, Gaza's health ministry is claiming at least 17,000 people, mostly women and children, have died in the last 2 months of fighting. Meanwhile, the Israelis are claiming that they've had Sinwar, the guy who started Hamas and leads Hamas, surrounded. And in the United Nations, Benjamin Netanyahu has said he appreciates the correct stance, he called it, the U.S. took in voting against a ceasefire, saying they are going to continue their just war to eliminate Hamas. Now, tell us about where Australia fits in all of this. Penny Wong has been in the news on this, and where this conflict is now going to go. Is it an endgame now for Hamas, or is it going to be a much more protracted conflict?
Well, James, I think we've got at least weeks to go with the Israeli military needing to still kill and capture more Hamas terrorists, including their leadership that's in Gaza. Of course, most of the Hamas leaders are living in luxury in Qatar. That's why they're willing to fight to the last Palestinian in Gaza. But this campaign, this war has further to go. And that's because Hamas, all this talk of ceasefires, you have to be able to trust the other party to the ceasefire. The Israeli government knows it can't trust Hamas. Hamas has no plan to do anything but widen the war against Israel and make it a regional war. And they're willing to inflict enormous suffering on the Palestinian people to achieve that aim.
Now, has Hamas fundamentally miscalculated in all of this? I mean, the thing that people never say is that you could have a ceasefire tomorrow if they just released all the hostages, but that's not going to happen. Have they misinterpreted Israeli resolve and the fact that they seem to be willing to keep finishing this fight to the end, no matter what, a lot of very noisy people in world opinion have to say?
Yes, I think you're right, James. I think Hamas miscalculated in two ways. The first way was what you're talking about. They thought the wider world might pressure the Israelis more effectively and stop the Israeli Defence Force from dismantling Hamas and its terrorist infrastructure in Gaza. That has not happened. The Israelis are doing what they must do to return security to Israel. The other big mistake that Hamas made was to believe all their fellow travellers, the Iranians, Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed proxy in Iran, and the Iraqi pro-Iranian, pro-Hezbollah groups in Iraq and Syria. The only people that have really come to Hamas's side in any meaningful way are the Houthi rebels in Yemen, who have been firing missiles and using drones in the Red Sea.
Yeah, I want to ask you, too, about Iran here, because it seems like they're playing a very interesting strategic game here. Obviously, the threat of them jumping in here is always ever present, but they seem to realize that that would create some sort of existential crisis for their own regime, or am I reading that wrong?
Well, I think you're right that the Iranian regime know they're deeply unpopular with a lot of the Iranian public. They've been dealing with pretty much civil protests around their very extreme religious laws that have had women beaten to death for having a scarf slightly out of place. So they're not in a strong position to actually wage a war in the region. And that's why they've been calibrating what they've been doing very carefully. And they must be looking at the amount of destruction in Gaza and thinking, we don't want that here.
And tell me about these Houthi rebels in Yemen. How much control does Iran have over them? Because they seem to be disrupting shipping and commerce in a very critical part of the world here. Could they just go off on their own and do something more disastrous that would wind up being the kind of mistake that does draw a wider conflict in, possibly involving the U.S.?
Well, they could. They've been pretty unconstrained, the Houthis. It looks like if they had more missiles and drones, they'd be firing more of them off. So they've threatened the US and others, saying, if you retaliate against any of the launch sites in Yemen, we will do that. We will try to paralyse shipping. But really, I think it's a lesson for Iran that they've been too clever by half in cultivating and equipping these proxies, and they're not really in their control.
Michael Showbridge, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Now, after the break, coming up, we'll get the latest from Brisbane as the race to replace Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk heats up. Plus, there's a push to have your super back Labor's pie-in-the-sky green schemes. We'll get the details from our panel after the break. Welcome back to the program. James Morrow here, filling in for Peter Credlin. Now, the race to replace Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk is heating up after her shock resignation yesterday. Was it a shock? Well, maybe not so much. Anyway, this afternoon, Health Minister Shannon Fentiman declared her intention to run for the Labor leadership. She is taking on her friend and factional ally, Stephen Miles. Joining me to get the latest are not one, but two Queenslanders, LNP member for Hinkler and former Resources Minister Keith Pitt, and former Howard Government Minister and Sky News contributor Gary Hargrave. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. All right, Keith, let's start with you.
Thank you.
Give us the inside running. How is this going to play out?
Oh, well, to be honest, who cares? It doesn't matter who the Premier is next week. Here's what won't change. You'll still have a problem with youth crime. We saw youth crime, a rampage on the weekend where they stole a car and rammed a police car. You've now had a 15-year-old with 50 offences has been charged. I've had another set of break-ins in Hervey Bay over the weekend. Poor old Aquaview there's copped it again. We still have people who are dying in ambulances because they're ramped. You can't get a bed in a hospital. None of those things will change. So I think the people of Queensland, they'll be very, very angry when the campaign comes around next time. They wanted to have their say. I think they'll still send them down the road. And Stephen Miles, I don't know how much he pays to get on an aircraft, mate, but the excess baggage that guy's got, it cost a fortune.
Now, Gary Hargrave, let's get your take on this here. How did this all go from Anastasia Palaszczuk being, we were told, beloved by the people for keeping Queensland hospitals for Queensland people and all of that other wonderful stuff that she did during the pandemic, to having herself be in this free fall in the polls to the point where she was basically, as far as I understand it, tapped on the shoulder?
Yeah, she was tapped on the shoulder, and at least that's better than being stabbed between the shoulders, but the effect's been the same. Look, James, they've forgotten about Queenslanders for years, and in fact, if you want to look at the polling, most Queenslanders want David Crisafulli as Premier, but he's not on the ballot in the caucus room on Friday because you've got to wait another 10 months for that. But park that to one side. This is a government that's been self-absorbed. It's been worried about itself, been worried about the spoils of offered, worried about the red carpet, worried about the image, worried about the friends they're hiring into different positions. They've forgotten about Queenslanders. They were incapable of making decisions about anything, anytime, anywhere, anymore for years. This has been a problem that's been building up for 5 or 6 years. And so, OK, it's reached a point now where they said, well, look, what have we got? We've got Stephen Miles, who people think's a joke. I don't think he is. I think he's actually a very serious contender. And he may well be the Premier in a week's time, and he's going to make massive changes. He'll get rid of the Gabba as a venue for the Olympics. That particular festering sore will be gone. There'll be a whole big revamping of the cabinet. And he won't say that now because he needs all of the votes he can get. You've got Cameron Dick, who is actually quite plausible and pleasant and lots of things going for him, but he's in the wrong faction, so he's the best he can be is deputy dog. But Shannon Fentiman, this is a woman who has failed up her entire political career. She was Minister for Child Safety, failed up to Attorney General, failed up to Health Minister. Now she wants to fail up to be Premier. Queenslanders deserve much better.
Gary, I'm just shocked at your cynicism here that somebody in the Labor Party might fail upwards. I can't think of any other examples in this country where that might have occurred. But hey, let's go
rampant.
over. It's rampant. But let's go over to someplace else quite warm, even warmer than Queensland, Dubai, where this morning Energy Minister Chris Bowen told nearly 200 countries attending COP28, the big climate gab fest in Dubai, we don't need to phase out fossil fuel emissions. We need to end the use of fossil fuels. Now, I mean, where do we begin here? Keith Pitt, can I get your just reaction to this here take?
Well, firstly, it's gone from being very expensive, unreliable, damage to the economy and jobs, to now ultimately being incredibly dangerous. I mean, if Chris Bowen is going to rub out those industries in Australia, how do you expect to make fertiliser? And if you can't make fertiliser, how will you maximise agriculture and feed the world and the nation? It's getting out of control. It doesn't matter what the goalpost is. It just keeps moving and moving and moving until now it's elimination. Well, I just want our response to be proportional to our contribution. How about we look after our people and make sure they can afford to pay their bills and they get to eat? Because without fertiliser, there's not much coming in terms of agriculture.
And I mean, Gary, the thing is too, he's talking about not just, phasing out emissions, but actually the use of fossil fuels. We export an awful lot of coal and other energy gas to countries like Japan and India. This would impoverish Australia if we were to stop doing this.
Well, look, the way this Chris Bowen bloke goes, we have no problem with running out of fertiliser because it's coming out of his mouth constantly. There is no doubt in my mind. There is no doubt in my mind, though, this is thought bubble becomes public policy, and it's a leadership failure by this Prime Minister. He has to rein this bloke in. We've got an $80 billion additional debt on interest on the money that we've been borrowing. And I was as critical of the previous government. Keith was in and out of the cabinet a few times. Wish he was still in there right now. But, the point is they borrowed a lot of money to get us through COVID. We got a big debt. Labor's added to that debt. By the way, the Abbott government inherited a massive debt from the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd years. So, government has just got to rein itself in and get out of people's lives and get out of the mining industry. I mean, Gina Reinhardt, Keith and I were both on the trip, so I'll declare it publicly. We paid for it, she didn't, but 4,950 pieces of red tape, green tape, blue tape, black tape she had to fill in order to get this massive new iron ore mine going in Western Australia. We are just dumb, stupid people allowing governments to get away with this. Vote them out, chuck them out, get rid of them now. If Albo had any guts, he'd test Chris Bowen's thesis at the ballot box and do it now.
I'm glad you said thesis. I thought you said something else for a second there. Gary, though, I'm sorry, Keith, I want to ask you about something else here, too. There's a push now to get these super funds to invest in all of this green stuff. I'm terrified at the idea that not only are they taking part of my money every month, but then they want to force it into these not necessarily economic projects. Get out of our business, right?
Well, this is not an investment, it's a tax. If you're not maximising return on your super because the government is taking your money and forcing it into some type of investment that the government wants, then it is a tax. Instead of the government paying for themselves with the existing taxpayers' funds, they're going to take your retirement funds, get your returns to be lower, which means you have less money in your retirement age. I thought this was the big plan. Well, clearly it's not. The big plan is now to have so much cash in super that it's actually running the nation. And I think that's a really dangerous precedent. It should be stopped. You want your super funds to return as much as possible because it's for your retirement. It's your money. It's your money.
It is your money. It's our money. And very quickly, it's not all craziness just in Australia. In California, a moving company is now being sued by the federal government in the U.S. because it violated age discrimination laws because its ads showed healthy young men moving boxes. How crazy is this?
Yeah, well, of course, we need older women moving boxes to be completely fair and equitable, James. Look,
avatars.
Young blokes should be doing the heavy lift. Young, yeah, that's right. Just a bit of artificial intelligence will fix up that in a moment. But look, James, we've got the Human Rights Commission in Canada saying Christmas is somehow offensive to those who don't participate in it. I mean, the Western world is going bonkers.
Guys,
and we've got to save it one family at a time.
It's a world gone mad, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us. Keith Pitt, Gary Hargrave, Steve Price is next, filling in for Andrew Bolt. Thanks so much for joining me tonight.